Hello, I'm Michael Thomas, the director of the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History here at UT Dallas. I join a host of friends, colleagues, former students, and above all family who are mourning the recent loss of Professor Richard R. Brettell. Dr. Brettell, or Rick as we knew him, was the founding director of our institute, and at the time of his death, he held the Margaret M. McDermott Distinguished Chair of Art and Aesthetic Studies and the Edith O'Donnell Distinguished University Chair in Art History here at UTD. He was arguably one of the most, if not the most, important and influential figures in the arts in the history of Dallas. He was a world-renowned scholar, a beloved teacher, and also a former director of the Dallas Museum of Art. He was the driving force behind two major future projects, the Athenaeum here at UTD and the Museum of Texas Art in Dallas, projects that kept him occupied until literally the last few days of his life. I want to welcome you to this presentation of Rick's last public lecture, a workshop on Paul Gauguin held at the DMA on January 30th, 2020. Originally planned as a seminar-style presentation in the Edith O'Donnell Institute's Research Center at the DMA, we knew almost immediately that Rick would draw a crowd that would far exceed our capacity there. So we moved the event into the museum's Horchow Auditorium. Rick is joined on stage by his collaborator, Dr. Elpida Vuitsis, as he walks us through Gauguin's masterpiece, Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going? What is clear in this presentation is that the always exuberant and brilliant mind of Rick Brettell was operating at full strength, even as he was in the last stage of his long battle with cancer. The mind, when paired with his uncanny wit and infectious enthusiasm, is a big part of what made Rick Brettell mean so much to so many people. Rick was at his best and most captivating when he stood in front of a work of art or even in front of a slide and allowed us to see and understand what he saw. We feel fortunate to have preserved one of the last of those moments in this presentation. Enjoy. Please join me in welcoming Rick Brettell.
Elpida, please come on up. This is Elpida Vuitsis. You say Vuitsis. And Elpida means hope. So if you forget Elpida and you don't want to say LP, just say hope. And we've festooned the table with all of the stuff that we've been working on for the last several years. In front of me are all of the volumes of the translations of all of Gauguin's disparate texts into English for the first time, done by my colleague, Dr. Vuitsis, who has her PhD from UTD. Her dissertation is that big pile of green volumes there. The other piles are the entry drafts for 1891 to 1895 for the Catalogue Raisonné of the Wildenstein Institute, which will be published sometime in the next calendar year. It's a project that I started working on about a decade ago, having agreed with Guy Wildenstein at a very nice lunch at his very nice townhouse in New York that it would really only take 2 to 3 years. And here we are 10 years later, and it hasn't come out. If it did come out in print form, it would be between 6 and 9 volumes. That's the extent of the research that we have done. And I wanted to sort of have with LP, have a kind of fireside chat about first my own involvement with Gauguin, which begins well before the Catalogue Raisonné, because of course you have to know something in order to be asked to do a Catalogue Raisonné. And I start with this, The Art of Paul Gauguin, which was an exhibition of which I was one of the 3 principal curators that was at the Art Institute of Chicago, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, and the Grand Palais in Paris. And it was an exhibition which came together as a result of all of these complicated politics, like exhibitions always do. And I was asked by Françoise Cachin, the late Françoise Cachin, then the director of the Musée d'Orsay, to come in on it. And I said to her, well, I've always thought that Gauguin was kind of a fraud, that he made things up and he was so pretentious and he had this kind of life that's so bigger than life that it overshadows his art. And I really don't know that I really want to become a world's authority on Gauguin. And fast forward 40 years, and I am. The other person involved in it at that time was also the late Kirk Varnedoe, who was working on the exhibition for the National Gallery. And I was the Chicago representative. And what happened is that we began to think about the ideal Gauguin exhibition. And the way that we decided to go about it was not just to do what had always happened to me when I'd done exhibitions earlier, which is you go to all the books with all the color plates and you pick out all the great things and you ask for them and you get most of them, and that's the exhibition. I said, these exhibitions cost so much money now that what we need to do is we really need to think of Gauguin from the ground up. So I had the hapless job of going to see the man who was giving away money for AT&T at a time when corporations gave lots of money for exhibitions, which they no longer do. And so I went up in the AT&T tower and I had my meeting with this guy and I made a presentation. And I made a presentation for a 3-year travel portion of it, where all 3 curators traveled all over the world to see everything in person, in public and private collections, before choosing the exhibition, something that had never been done for an exhibition. And I walked out of there with $3.5 million. So it was an effective presentation. And indeed, we did travel all over. We went to Japan, we went to New Zealand, we went to South America. We had really funny tales in Rio de Janeiro. We were all over Europe, and we saw hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Gauguin. We emerged with a picture of the artist, which was very different than all of the color plates that were at that time in all of the books, which are all the paintings in the well-known museums. Discounting works in obscure museums and discounting works in private collections. But the rub, this painting was not in the exhibition. So where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? And why wasn't it in the exhibition? And of course, that has everything to do with museum politics. Imagine if you're the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and you own Gauguin's masterpiece, an indisputable masterpiece, and you weren't one of the 3 museums that are doing the exhibition. Suddenly it needs lining, it has flake loss, it's in very bad condition, it was this and that, and da-da-da-da. And so we had to figure out a way of convincing the man who had actually been on my dissertation committees at Yale, Alan Shestak, who was the director at Boston, to lend it. And so what we learned as we were writing this hypothetical entry for this painting is that it wasn't just a thing in itself, and here you have it in all its glory. And this is going to be a talk with which Elpida plays a huge role in, and that is this. We discovered, because of a review of the exhibition, the first exhibition in which the painting was shown at Vollard's Gallery in Paris in 1898, that it was surrounded by 8 paintings that were what were called Fragmentary Replicas, fragments or replicas of the big picture, which means that Gauguin created not just a painting, but an entire environment in which, as you moved through it, you kept seeing things repeatedly. Figures would come and go. Things would be transformed. There would be chromatic transformations. Animals that were in one would not be in another. And you'd be involved in this kind of hypnotic world of interrelational works of art. No one had ever discovered that. This review, though it was published in the Revue Blanche, one of the most famous things, had never been associated with all of these paintings. And so we found the paintings. And this one's in Buenos Aires, this one's in Russia, this one's in Russia, this one's coming up for sale soon if you want to buy it. This one's in the Ordrupgaard in Copenhagen, this one's in Russia, this one's in the Barber Institute, and the last one is at the National Gallery in Washington. And all of them were just thought to be these kind of funny pictures that weren't as successful as the big picture, without anybody realizing that they were all made to be seen together. And I'll never forget, I worked with Peter Zegers in the Prints and Drawings department at the Art Institute, and we made this little little model of the room in Volars that we imagined that the paintings were in, and we had them to scale, and we folded up this little room, and we figured out what the wall colors were from descriptions and reviews, and we folded up all the little things and put it in the plane and took it to Boston and set it up on Alan Shestak's desk and said, if you lend the big picture, we will get as many of the small pictures as we can, and we'll put together for the first time since 1898, since November of 1898, this exhibition, which was a completely revelatory exhibition at the time that it was done. And 2 months went by, and then 3 months went by. And then the letter came again, significant flake loss, problems of puckering, difficulties in shipment, has to be shipped flat. And so then we did, what about Washington only? It could go in a truck flat to Washington only. Too difficult. So the whole thing failed. And so we did the greatest Gauguin exhibition ever done without his masterpiece, without this painting. And what happened as a result of that is that the painting began to kind of gnaw at me and make me mad at it, as if somehow it was its fault. And so, as Elpida knows, I started 10 years ago working on the Catalogue Raisonné, and I worked pretty chronologically, going as chronological as you could be with Gauguin. And I worked through, and then she came onto the project and began to help me enormously. After Paul Galvez, who's sitting in the audience, also was working in the Paris office on the project. So we have 3 of us who are working on the project in this room today. And what happened is that I got to 1897. This painting is signed and dated 1897 in the upper right corner. And I got to 1897 and I thought, I'm just not going to deal with it. I'm just going to go right on. And I'll come back to it at the end. So last summer, Carol and I are in Williamstown as usual, and my whole job for the summer was to write the draft of the notice of the entry for this painting, and I spent the entire summer doing it. And I realized that there's no book on this painting at all. There's a book by a French painter, which is in even bad French, and it's really not very interesting, but there's no book which deals with the incredible, enormous ambitions of the painting. And what got me off the dime was Elpida, and it was Elpida's voice translating Gauguin. And the reason that did it is that Gauguin wrote all these books. And all of these books are, for the most part, unpublished. They're in his handwriting. If they are published, they're published in facsimile. And so you have to have good French, and you have to read his handwriting today, and you have to have enough money to buy expensive facsimiles. And it's not like reading by the fire. It's hard work reading Gauguin's texts. And it was my challenge to Elpida, whose first language is French and whose second language is English, to translate them into English so that, first of all, they get out of the French handwriting, and secondly, so that they become books. They become things that we read. And so Elpida spent 5 years, 4 years? 4 years, translating from all of these texts beginning with 1893 and moving to the end of his life, only one of which really had successfully been translated publicly, and it turned out to be not such a good translation. So we learned an enormous amount, but one text called Diverses choses in French, and which she translates as this and that, was a text that had never been translated and had never even been exposed in facsimile, and exists bound into the back of the Louvre manuscript of Noah Noah, and is only available to people who read, what's that called? A CD. It's if you have a CD and you want to read this handwriting, and of course nobody does. So when Diverses choses was translated for the first time and we all started to read it, it became clear to me that this painting, the origins of this painting, are very much far deeper in Gauguin's thought and in Gauguin's practice than we had first thought. And so together we began to be involved in the Catalogue Raisonné. First, Elpida came on as my research assistant, which she does so capably, and she began to channel me, and so now she writes like me and I write like her, and we have no idea. She used to, the entries used to, they were black and blue. I was black and she was blue, and I thought, this is ridiculous, and so we finally just made them all black. And neither of us oftentimes can know which paragraph was written by who. And what I do the first draft, and then she comes in and checks everything, but not just checks everything, thinks about the enormous amount of material that is available to us in our 3 offices. We have 3 offices of the Wildenstein-Plattner Institute Gauguin Catalogue Raisonné. And this is our office in Dallas. And then we have 3 people, well, actually 4, with Sylvie Creusal at the top, who is the most important living Gauguin authority and who did the first volumes of the Gauguin Catalogue Raisonné and is one of our dearest friends. And underneath her, Françoise Marnoni, who is the managing editor at the Institute, and Sophie Pietri, who is the head of archives at the Wildenstein Institute, because there's a ton of archival material that there is nowhere else there. And Elena Kuzmina, a good Russian name, and she's a data researcher, and she's a stunning researcher who knows all the languages, and she can track down the German exhibitions and the Italian exhibitions and the Spanish exhibitions. And what you know, the longer you work in museums, the more you know that what is in the provenance, the history of ownership, and the exhibition history of any work of art is largely suspect. And you have to check everything. And so we have spent, the reason that it's taken us 10 years is that nothing has been left unchecked, and that we have done extraordinary research as a group. And then Liz Goriab, who's the executive director of the Institute in New York, Caitlin Sweeney, who's the director of digital publications, because it will be a digital publication, which means that we'll be able to update it when we learn new things. And as soon as they push print, and not print, as soon as they push publish, and it goes online, both of us and all of our friends will get letters from people, oh, did you know this? And what about such and such? And so in a kind, what we'll do as a group is we'll gather the new material and add it, not in a rolling fashion, but every so many years in order to bring it up to date. and then Martin Lorenz, who has created this digital platform for the Catalogue Raisonné, which is absolutely state-of-the-art. It's extraordinary. So we have it's not just us. It's a whole group of people who have been working their butts off for the last umpty-ump years on this project. And then we have somehow also made discoveries. And this is something which I was on the phone with Jay Pack in his office in Harlan Crow's development in Dallas Hall down the way, bidding on the phone through heritage auction galleries because we didn't have the money to buy this, but he had the money to buy it and he donated it to us. And we bought at this sale an unpublished and unknown dictionary in Gauguin's hand from Tahitian to English, made right after he got to Tahiti, when he's trying to learn to navigate the language. And so in dealing with all the Tahitian titles and all of this, there's a whole new gold mine, which is right here. And it's unknown to scholarship, completely unknown to scholarship. And it was at Heritage Auction Gallery in Dallas, Texas, though the sale was in New York. So it's extraordinary how these things happen. And there are many, many new ideas of what Gauguin thought words meant in this, which are different from the standard dictionaries that he came to have access to, and give a much greater richness to our sense of his titles. And here, there are just 4 pages, but it's 4 very precious pages. And then I thought it would be, here we are in the DMA, and what's one of the other, not just finding new digital, new archival material, which we find a lot frequently, but also really looking carefully into the physical matrix of the work of art. And the DMA owns one of the most important and one of the most ambitious early paintings from the first year that Gauguin was in Tahiti. And it's called Raro Teo Oviri. It was painted in 1891. It's signed and dated in the lower left. The title, which of course none of you know what it means sort of roughly under the pandanus trees. So these trees which, their leaves come down and they make these sort of patterns on the earth, and Gauguin was convinced that they were a kind of form of communication or writing. And the 2 figures which are carrying these large fruits and other things which derive from Poussin. They're a kind of quotation from the summer of the 4 seasons of Poussin in the Louvre. So you're dealing with this man who is reading dictionaries, looking out the window, thinking about works of art in the past, kind of creating an entire world which is not the world of Tahiti. It's a multi-layered, complex world known to an artist who is absolutely, he's one of the artists when we work on him. It's a little bit like Mark Rosen when he works on Leonardo. We know when we work on Gauguin, and Mark knows when he works on Leonardo, that the artist we're working on is smarter than we are. And we are kind of climbing this mountain to learn about him. Well, this painting turns out to exist in 2 versions. And what's interesting is that the 2 versions had never really been clearly related to each other. And this is the second version, which is in the Minneapolis Art Institute in Minneapolis. And you can see it's rather different in a couple of ways, in tonality, in size, and in style. It's much smoother. The colors are richer. It's got a more purple rather than reddish cast. And both of the paintings are signed, titled, and dated 1891. And we all thought, well, why would Gauguin make these 2 paintings of these? Why would he do that? And for years, I was giving these bullshit lectures saying that they were traduction en couleur, that they were about the act of translation in which you use color as your mode of translating, and so that the paintings have different meanings because they're suffused with different color. Well, that is not true. What ended up being true, the DMA was generous enough to lend its painting to the Minneapolis Art Institute, which at that time, this is before the incredible lab conservation studio at the DMA, at that time they had the better conservation studio. So our painting went to Minneapolis, and we drew all the Gauguin scholars in the world. And at that time, our the wonderful Sue Canterbury, who you all now know as the curator of American art here, was the curator of American and European art there, and was the one who was masterminding the project there. And Nikki, who's here today, wasn't here today. Heather McDonald was here then, and we had all the great Gauguin scholars from everywhere. Even Sylvie Croussard, who hates traveling, came from Paris and took hip-hop lessons in a dance studio. And we looked at these things, and we determined absolutely through X-ray, pigment analysis, all the modes of doing it, that the painting on the left in Dallas was painted in 1891 by Paul Gauguin, and that the painting on the right was painted later, probably in 1894 or even 1895 in Paris, using a tracing and possibly even having both paintings in the room at the same time. And I'm not going to explain to you all of the incredibly complex technical things that enabled us to reach that conclusion, and I'll just ask that you accept what I'm telling you is true, because I'm convinced that it is. But what's interesting, and the reason that I bring this example, is not only is the earlier and more and kind of prime painting at the DMA, but both paintings are dated 1891, while only one painting was actually made in 1891. And that means that everybody before this had believed Gauguin's dating. If Gauguin dates something to something, that's when it was done. So when you look at the 1964 Catalogue Raisonné, if it's dated 1891, it's in 1891. If it's dated 1888, it's in 1888. And what we've learned is that there are lots of migratory dates, and that works of art are dated in with kind of complex systems, which we're going to get to as an important part of this. And you can see that the style of this painting is much more like the style of the paintings that he made in Paris, not in Tahiti, and that it's a remaking, a reconsideration of this earlier theme, and a fascinating one at that. And I've always hated the painting at the left, but that's neither here nor there. So here is Du venons-nous. It's not exactly a sharp image. It's much larger than the thing actually is. When she was working on Divers Choses, she found this passage that had been there all along, but that didn't have any meaning. It was like disassociated from everything that any picture that we knew. And it was sort of in there, and it was in his Gauguin's usual fluent French, and it was in his handwriting. And because it was not published, only one person, his biographer David Sweetman, had bothered to extract a paragraph from it and put it in his unfootnoted biography. So I began to think about it this summer, and what's interesting is that you go to a tabula rasa, and I'm showing you a tabula rasa. And as you look at the tabula rasa, I'm going to read you a translation by Elpida Vuitsis of this passage, which is the origins of Du venons-nous, completely unacknowledged in the literature. A description of the work of art that I would like to paint. It measures 6 meters in length and 2 in height. Why these precise measurements, you ask? On the one hand, they correspond to the exact width of my studio, and as for its height, anything taller would be extremely tiring. The canvas is already stretched, prepared, and smoothed with care. Not a knot, not a fold, not a stain. Just think of what a masterpiece it will be. Geometrically speaking, the composition's lines will start from the middle. I will begin by painting elliptical lines swelling like waves until the edges. The principal figure will be that of a woman transformed into a statue, still alive, but an idol just the same. The figure will spring forth from a cluster of trees, unlike anything anyone has ever seen, but this is paradise, so the vision's fantasy is implied. She does not represent the statue of Pygmalion coming to life and then becoming human, but rather a woman becoming a god. Nor is she Lot's daughter transformed into a statue of salt, God no. In every corner, the flowers emerge with their aromatic fragrances. Children romp about in the gardens, and young women gather fruit, which are then piled up into massive baskets and made as an offering at the idol's feet by robust young people in a gesture of the utmost grace. The painting's aura must be serious, like a religious work, melancholic yet cheerful at the same time, like the children. Oh, I almost forgot. I would also like to add some adorable little black pigs sniffing at all the food that we will be feasting on, their nervous tails wiggling in envy. I will place my life-size figures in the foreground, but the rules of perspective will force me to elevate my horizon line quite high, and my canvas only measures 2 meters in height, so I'll be unable to fully portray the magnificent mango trees in my garden. Who said painting was easy? This is a perfect example of a person being stoned for trampling all over the rules of art. To communicate severity, my colors will be somber, and to convey joy, my colors will sing as clearly as the day is bright. And how do I go about creating a simultaneously light and dark painting? I can always play it safe and shoot for the happy middle, which always pleases the majority, but never really excites me. My God, painting is difficult when you wish to express your thoughts using pictorial and figurative formal devices. Of course, the work which I wish to paint is far from being completed, but my desire will overpower me because I am weak. Strength and weakness. I'll sleep on that. So this is the tabula rasa, 2 meters by 6 meters. It's the proportions are right. Obviously not the dimensions because it's a slide. This is the first drawing of Du venons-nous, superimposed on it in the size that it is in a letter in the drawing. And you can see already that Du venons-nous is smaller than the big painting that he had already stretched and primed, not a problem to it. This is the dimensions that he cites for the canvas that became Du venons-nous in a letter to Daniel de Montfrid written in February of 1898. And this is Du venons-nous. So what you have is this vision, and you have a period of time that is much longer than we thought. In the letter to Montfrid, which I'm not going to read to you because I don't want to read too much, Gauguin says that he painted the painting in a month, that he painted in a fever of activity. He worked day and night, and that at the end of the period of time that he painted the painting, he went up in the hills and took arsenic so that he would die. And so it's a painting he associated in his mind with suicide. And what happens when you ingest a poison oftentimes is that you throw it up. and so he threw it up. He even goes so far as to imagine that he takes arsenic as dyes and his body is consumed by ants. That's attractive, but that's what he says in the letter. And he struggles down the hill, and it's about Christmas time. And for Gauguin, Christmas time is really important. Van Gogh cuts off his ear on Christmas Eve. Christmas, his daughter's birthday, a daughter who dies just before this all happens at the age of 19, and he just found out about it, the woman in the middle of the painting turning into a statue. All of these things are kind of twirling through him, and it's when the Christmas boat comes from France with money and letters. And this year, 1897, the year that this painting is dated, the Christmas boat had no money. The first time since he'd gotten back to Tahiti. And so Gauguin was flat broke. He had worked on this canvas feverishly. He had probably worked on it for a much longer period of time because Elpida, in working to date the passage that I just read you, knows that it was written probably in the summer of 1897, way before the 1 month of feverish activity, which he refers to. So you have a progressive physical diminution of the picture. You have a transformation of the picture from a woman goddess central figure with all of these celebratory figures around it to this rather somber painting in which the main figure both is off-center and is male. Sweetman even points out that he has a prominent erection, which I defy you to find, but here is the drawing at the bottom of the letter to Manfred in February of 1898, and you can even see here that the painting that exists in Boston is different from the painting at the bottom of the letter, and the dimensions are also different. The big canvas is 2 meters by 6 meters. In this letter, the dimension of this canvas is 4 meters 50 by 1 meter 70. And the actual dimensions of the painting in Boston are 3 meters 75 by 1 meter 40. So what's happened is that Gauguin has compressed and compressed and compressed the design. And then the question becomes, what happened to all that canvas? And what was he thinking about? And how was he incorporating the initial idea of the canvas into a future program of painted study? This is the photograph taken in Gauguin's studio of the painting in July of 1898, just before it was shipped by a photographer named Le Masson. And you can see even here that Le Masson couldn't get far enough away from the canvas to have the whole thing. And so it ends here. You can only see the legs of the baby. You don't see the dog at all. And this side is whole. Unfortunately, this slide is a little bit cut off. And there are various aspects of it, because it's a black and white photograph made in 1898, that look rather different than the painting, but it was made just before the painting and those 8 fragmentary replicas were rolled up, were unstretched, were rolled up, were sent to Paris for exhibition. There's another preparatory drawing for this painting, which is in the Museum of Oceanic Art in Paris. Why? God knows, because it was given by Vollard. And it too is really different from both the canvas and the photograph and the drawing at the base of the letter to Manfred. but it's squared as if to be transferred to something. So all of these things are kind of like an enigma with an enigma with an enigma. And here's this again, much longer. The figure here almost in the center. And looking not so much like a fruit picker that he is, but looking like somebody hanging in another kind of way. And the letter to Montfort doesn't really talk about what's in the painting. First of all, the goddess in the painting is much smaller than the goddess in the drawing. And so you can see, as we're dealing with all these things, that Gauguin is transforming as he goes. And this whole idea of it being a month that he works feverishly and he goes to commit suicide is a fiction. And he worked on the painting from the summer of 1897 until the summer of 1898. It's a baby. It's a full gestation period of a work of art. And then here one sees it again. And what's interesting is I'm going to take you through first the exhibition, because these pictures arrive in Paris, and they arrive in October in Paris. And they arrive at this friend's house who doesn't know what to do with them. And Gauguin tells him to stretch them and frame them very simply in white frames. And he's going to install them in his own studio or in the studio of another artist, but ends up convincing Vollard within 2 weeks to install them in Vollard's studio. And that means that they were seen by everybody. And I've never done this before, but I want to take you all through that room one by one, so you see each one. This is actually the first painting from the group that I ever saw. It's in a private collection in Buenos Aires of a wonderful, beautiful woman named Nelly Blaquier. And you kind of do this double take when you see it, because was this sort of cut out of the picture. And it had never been reproduced in color. It's only been reproduced in black and white. And when I first saw it, I was just stunned by it. And this is an accurate color reference, so that each of the smaller canvases is a chromatic variation on the big canvas. And what they do is they force you, I assume they force you, because none of us have ever been in this room, because the room has never been put together. George Shackelford did the most complete version because he did the show for Boston, and by that time, the painting could be loaned mysteriously. So it was loaned to Paris and to Boston. And he didn't get this, but he got a good many of them. And you can see this part of the picture with additional things. The fruit on the ground isn't there. The figures are not there. The spatial relationships of these figures is different. The background is different. You can see more clearly the fruit that the figure is picking. This is in the Soviet Union, in Russia, sorry. When I first saw it, it was the Soviet Union. And it's like suffused with gold. It's this glorious picture. And the figure derives from a drawing in the Louvre that was at that time ascribed to Rembrandt. And Gauguin took the drawing. It's a literal copy of the drawing with the same clothing and the same gestures and everything, which is the deep source for the picture and for the figure in the painting. So again, and this person is this guy, whatever gender it is picking breadfruit, because that's a breadfruit leaves, and there are the two goats, and there's one goat. You can hardly see him here. And you begin thinking about the leaves and the trees and these suffused colors. Here are two goats again against these rosy pink beaches, and there are figures down here near the end, and flowers, and this figure here is this figure here. So moved all about, and there are lotus flowers in it, and there are no lotus flowers anywhere in the main picture. So what Gauguin was clearly doing is, after having come to terms with the big picture, which was now much smaller than he thought it was going to be, was to let it spread around a whole series of smaller pictures, which are a kind of poetic text. This is a bird, very hard to read. This painting is very hard to read, and this is a good new photograph of it. It's coming up for sale. It was in a private collection in Tahiti for years. For years, this was the only Gauguin painting in Tahiti. And it was in the collection of this wonderful young man who owned the electrical company. And it has these fantastic burao trees in the background. It's got the green vegetation in the back. Is it sky? Is it a field? What is it? It's this kind of world of color in the background, and then these odd striped forms that looked like palm leaves lying on the edge. Here are women frolicking in the pool. This is the Barber Institute, and if you look very carefully, you see a woman frolicking in a pool up here, a tiny one, single one in a kind of aura. And over here you see a pool which is a little bit more lively, but with a flame in it. And again, you're going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. This is a picture, again, in Russia, and it has something which isn't in the main picture at all, which is this figure called Oviri that Gauguin had just made. It's a ceramic figure that he just made in France, leaving in France. He didn't have it with him, so he's working with memories of it in Tahiti. And Oviri means the tueuse, the murderess. And she has this little, obviously dead pup or something in her hand. It's these big eyes. It's a very mysterious thing. It's also a vase. You're supposed to have plants coming out of it. And it was the object that Gauguin asked to have sent to him in Hiva Oa to be on his tomb. So, again, death, suicide, the death of the daughter, all of these images going back and forth. Oops. National Gallery in Washington with the Hina figurine, dark in color. The two figures with different colors and different headdresses. This figure and a figure which is not at all in the painting, but which reminds you of the fallen Eve. So this is not the fruit picker, but the fallen Eve. And of course, making the fruit picker a male and having in the same room the fallen Eve with red hair and greenish skin and this fantastic necklace. And these two figures over here they're yellowish and here they're brown. This figure, which is a kind of combination of this figure and this figure, with different sorts of gestures, and all of this orange in it. I mean, I would kill to be in this room for a day or 2 days or something, and just to be able to move through it and look at it, because it is the greatest collective work of art of the 19th century. There's nothing that can come near it. And it was only up for 2 weeks. 2 weeks in 1898, and it's then been split and never really properly understood. This is the ugliest of the paintings, and there's an even uglier fake in the museum in Belgrade, which is one of them, and which is this figure, the river goddess figure here with the flaming bushes, and this is in the Ordrup Guard. This is one of those paintings that you know that he was working like crazy to get it done so he could get it on the boat and get it back to France, because he wanted to have these 8 pictures. And these are all of these smaller pictures are all exactly the same size. And they're all the same size as Monet's haystacks. So thinking about series and thinking about things that can be together in exhibitions and then sold separately. Gauguin was always the capitalist, even though he was thinking about the grande décoration. He knew that probably no one would buy the big picture, but maybe the little pictures would sell. Now, you remember that description, and I have always wondered about these other two paintings, because these other two paintings are the paintings that accord very well with the passage that I read to you at the very beginning. The passage in which he's talking about a single figure in the center turning into a statue with people gathering fruit and making offerings, young people all around. And so this is in the Tate, and this is in the Pushkin Museum. And what's riveting is that you could paint both those pictures on what's left of the big canvas. So this is the big canvas as it started out with, and you could do it in various ways. And I think probably the picture at the bottom did have the main figure in the middle, and that Gauguin moved it around so that the main figure was on the right for a whole series of reasons, which will take me pages and ages to explain. But Rupe on the right, and this other painting in front. Here it is. This is at the Tate. It's a small, long painting, painted in 1898, probably early in the year when he's working on the whole scheme for the big picture. And this picture, which is one of the glories of modern painting, and which was not exhibited until 1903, the year of Gauguin's death, in an exhibition at Volars Gallery after his death, where you can't imagine that it was not seen by Matisse, and where its effect on color painting sort of thunders through the 20th century. The idea that they started on one canvas, that Gauguin, in making this canvas, was realizing several visions. And if I'd remembered to bring the slide, I would have brought the wonderful portrait of Meyer de Haan, Gauguin's great Jewish friend, with whom he lived in Pont-Aven, and who had him read Milton's Paradise Lost. And in the portrait of Meyer de Haan is Paradise Lost, Paradis Perdu in French. And what clearly these paintings refer to in some way is the two sides of Milton's text, the longer and more elaborate and more Christologically important Paradise Lost, and the shorter and simpler and more beautiful Paradise Regained, another text that we don't know whether Gauguin read, but we know that he knew about it, and that he was thinking in all of these complex ways. So you've got Paradise Regained and Paradise Regained and Paradise Lost. So now, in this is just all about the dates and all about the first exhibition. I realized I was going to do a Gauguin seminar this term with LP and read texts and go through all of Gauguin's career. And I realized when I was preparing to talk to you about this that I could have done an entire class on this painting, because it's worth it. Now, when he was working on it, he was also writing in divers choses, the same text. And the later passages in divers choses, which have been brilliantly translated by Elpida, and all of the sources in comparative religion that Gauguin read in distant Tahiti, sometimes with his next door neighbor and other times through correspondence in the Mercure de France, lead to the sort of creation of a man who is deeply informed in comparative religion and in the early history of Christianity. Gauguin was fervently Christian, something that people don't really understand. And I've taken out of this very long passage, a rather long passage too, that I want to read to you as you look at this, because what it will make clear is that Gauguin was much better at crystallizing his thoughts in pictorial form than he was in written form. But his attempts in written form are so stunning and make us think really of the breadth of his mind and imagination. So I want you to look at it as I read this text. And this is a text that was written as he was painting this. But just as the human being's natural transformation into the embodiment of pure spirit, into the idealized form known as divine, is a result of the logical and natural consequences of his evolution from a living molecule to a natural life form, and finally into a superior spiritualized being, then his disembodiment from his material self must also undergo to the same process. This is the logical consequence of man's evolution and parallel to his general ascension through life stages, the final result being the progressive disengagement of self from the group and from the shackles of his physical existence, a process consummated through time in the animal world and which had hitherto given life to the material realm. When the simple life form progressively evolved from an atom, or whether when the soul was also like a germ, it transformed from a basic type of passive energy into a progressively more active, powerful, and uninhibited will, attaining the different stages of the natural hierarchical order before finally reaching man. Darwin. After having experienced all these transformations and passed through every level of existence until reaching its ultimate emancipation, where it was provided with all the necessary qualifications, abilities, and characters required to act and find its way through life as the ultimate embodiment of a supreme self. This natural evolution resulted in the metamorphosis of the life form into the ideal being. In a way, its completion and crowning invalidated any likeness to its prior existence, which in its rudimentary form was simply a physical expression, a figurative manifestation made up of material symbols. It is beyond this ideal self's literal and symbolic implications where lies the meaning of the spirit's purpose. The ultimate being embodies the pure soul's superior, individual, and communal reasons for living. Having arrived at this potent stage of existence, this more or less developed life form can appropriately be characterized as an ordinary mortal, and as a result can succumb to death, its body decomposing and eventually disappearing. Its soul will most assuredly also vanish, only to be revived and regenerated. Its faculties once again diffused, its previous strength and virtues reanimated. Guided by its vital energies, forces, renewal, and expansion acquired in its previous life as a human cocoon, the resulting soul is a pure spirit, unable to retain the memory of its previous existence, much like a newborn baby. Once unshackled from its previous material shell by virtue of its previous will to live, it is in need of action. It necessitates life. Spontaneously, of course, it projects itself everywhere, in every ethereal corner of the sky, ready to move at will in every region of this immense space. It is the matrix, the primitive and perfect core of the organism's aggregate existence. It projects itself outward, eager to understand and know everything, to experience every love and joy, and is willing to roam every basic realm of existence, having only eternity to look forward to. Much like the elusive, it is ready to penetrate the totality of life's deepest physical elements, to analyze every rational aspect and make sense of it, to uncover the essential and living truth of man's existence and the purpose of this universal life. From the infinite realm of space to every corner of nature, it henceforth maps out its definitive course of action and development, where it can adapt within an essentially active environment, progressing indefinitely in relation to its altered and spiritualized self. Now the question remains, if combined with other ideas, modern society accepts the ones already discussed here, not only because they incite interest, but also because they make logical sense. How would a philosophical and universal conception of nature contradict the Bible's doctrine or Christ's message? In light of the aforementioned insights discussed here, any subsequent investigation of Christianity by modern society must aspire toward an affinity with these ideas. It must gather and assimilate them within the same category of philosophical understanding in order to restore their richer and more fertile meanings as a whole. There is a but. This must be done outside of the Catholic Church, which is rigid in its hypocritical religiosity and unyielding when it comes to its obsessive rituals and preserving its spiritual essence and upholding its devout practices. The Catholic Church uses them as a means to enslave through its theocratically oppressive tendencies, its infallibly unjustified dogmatism, and its irrational occultism. All of these characteristics are in complete contradiction with the true biblical doctrine and Christ's message, and finally, with modern society as a whole. So, we look at this painting, and none of the figures in it are co-equal with anything that's said in that passage, but this idea of being individuals in search of a kind of great spiritual awakening, rooted in Christianity and rooted in the fall of man and in Christ, who was for Gauguin the most important of all of the prophets that was to exist. And Gauguin understood all of the Old Testament prophets. And one sees here the beginning of the world. Where do we come from? If we read it like an Oriental scroll, which is what he wanted, you start with the baby and you go right to left and you end with the old dying woman at the right. The baby is genderless. Everybody else, with the exception of the male fruit picker, is a woman. And, or maybe this child is this is a genderless child. Gender and Gauguin are highly complicated things. The whole atmosphere of this painting has this wonderful clarity and is also wonderfully elusive. And this is the same case with Gauguin's prose. Gauguin he's stumbling over words, and what LP does is she makes his stumbling French into much clearer English, while not undercutting what he says, kind of making it clearer than he does before. And you know from the passage that I read to you how deep a thinker he was, as he was, at night when he can't paint and he's reading by a lamp, and he's thinking, and he's reading books, and he's thinking about his life, and he's unwell. He's been in the hospital a couple of times. He's tried to commit suicide. His daughter has died. He's gone through all of these things, and he's made this du venons-nous. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Thank you.